Good morning to those of you guys joining us from the US side, and good evening to those of you guys joining us from the China side. And we're very glad that everybody is here joining us. My name is Devin Lau, and I am the Assistant Director for Yale Center Beijing. For those of you guys that this is your first time joining one of our events, let me give you a quick word of introduction. Yale Center Beijing was established in 2014 as Yale's first and only university-wide center outside of New Haven, of course. And we have been lucky enough to host professors from across Yale and all its departments and schools in order to showcase a lot of the amazing research that's going on at Yale. And even in this past year of pandemic, we've been utilizing Zoom to actually increase our outreach to people beyond just Beijing and even beyond China to reach a global audience. And so we've been really excited to have a variety of topics of discussion, everything from art history to astronomy, to biology, to music, to all sorts of things. And so we're very much active. Of course, those of you in China are already back to pretty much normal functioning society. But here in the US, a lot of us have been in our house for over a year still. And so it's really good to be able to have these conversations with various Yale professors. Today, of course, we have a very, unfortunately, very relevant and pertinent topic, which is racism in US history and anti-racism. And as you're all aware, in the US, there has been an increase in anti-Asian rhetoric and actual physical attacks in the past year or so. And of course, that's in addition to all the other issues regarding race that we're facing, including Black Lives Matter, years of rhetoric about building a wall, and just increased racism and antagonism across the board. And so, of course, none of this is new, and it's all rooted in a very deep history in the US. And so today we're very lucky to have Professor Yii-Jan talk about this history and how the recent rise of racism is very much rooted in rhetoric that's been used throughout the US and throughout its history. Professor Lin is Associate Professor of New Testament at Yale. She has a master's degree from University of Chicago, TEDS, as well as a PhD from Yale. Her first book, The Erotic Life of Manuscripts, examines how metaphors of race, family, evolution, and genetic inheritance have shaped the goals and assumptions of New Testament textual criticism from the 18th century to the present. And her current book project, very much relevant and something that she's actually been working on before all this recent news, is going to be called, I think, Immigration and Apocalypse, focusing on the revelation of John in the history of American immigration. And so focusing on this idea of apocalypticism and the use of revelation in the political discourse surrounding American immigration, both in utopian visions of America as well as dystopian fear of outsiders. So I can't think of a more prophetic piece of writing, very much in line with talking about the book of Revelation. And so a very unique angle in understanding rhetoric and text, and we're extremely lucky to have her joining us today. And so without further ado, I turn it over to Professor Lin.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to share my screen. So thank you very much for having me and for coming to this talk. I'm honored and I'm excited to be able to share what is part of, as Devin said, my current book project, which is titled Immigration and Apocalypse, US Immigration in the Book of Revelation. I begin with this title slide with this photo, and it is a photo of the women's quarters at the Angel Island Detention Center in the San Francisco Bay. And this detention center was functioning from around 1910 until the 1940s. And it is where they kept mostly non-white immigrants coming to the San Francisco port. And generally, anyone who was coming, this is mostly Chinese immigrants at the time, but others coming from Asia were also held in this detention center and subjected to examination and interrogation, and women were separated from men, et cetera. And this is where the women stayed. And part of it's been kept or redone to reflect what it was like and the conditions that they stayed in while they kept there. So just keep this in mind. I'm going to lead us through a thematic journey that will today focus ultimately on anti-Chinese immigration in the history of the United States. So you might be thinking, what does US immigration and US anti-Chinese immigration in particular have to do with apocalypse? That seems like a very strange juxtaposition. And what does she mean by apocalypse? Because of course there are several different meanings to this, right? There's the broader popular meaning and then a narrower historical meaning. So we have the broader popular usage of apocalyptic generally is relating to world-ending catastrophe, disaster, or change of world. Sometimes this means a glorious entry into a new place, a heaven, utopia. And this is related to the immigration and the immigration experience in which you're changing one world for another. There's a hope for some sort of utopic arrival. It often ends in catastrophe and disaster. So there is that broader popular understanding of apocalyptic or apocalypse that's related to immigration. There's also the far narrower term, which is relating to ancient Jewish literature, a genre of ancient literature that talks about visions in which somebody, a prophet, a seer, is able to see a separate world, is able to ascend into the heavens and see a series of events that are going to come, usually violent, usually destructive, destruction of one world, and the entering in, the ushering in of a new. And this is particularly, I'm thinking, of course, of the book of Revelation, the last book of the New Testament, which is what my focus will be on today, and the relation of that to US leaders thinking and also general population in America thinking about immigration in a particular conception of the United States and of America. So my argument is that Revelation in particular has shaped this conception and ideation of America from its discovery to the present. And this conception of America as that apocalyptic destination has then in turn shaped US and American attitudes towards immigration. So put another way, by understanding the US as this apocalyptic destination, as an exceptional heaven-like place, the US leaders and its population have adopted an also apocalyptic attitude towards who gets to come in and who needs to be kept out at the same time. So that is part and parcel of that metaphorical thinking. So considering these similar images, we have both in fact referencing, whether directly, as we see in the Greek icon on the left, or indirectly at the poster on the right, both referencing the New Jerusalem. So this is a heavenly city referenced in Revelation. It's this notion of America as a shining city on the hill coming from this kind of ideation of the US as a New Jerusalem. And it's first written so far as I know, by John Winthrop in 1630. So this is a famous sermon encouraging the Puritans who are coming towards America in the 17th century to be a shining moral example, because America is going to be a shining city on the hill. So Winthrop here in this sermon is quoting the Bible. It's not from Revelation, it's from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5. But in that text, the city on a hill is definitely Jerusalem, right? And Winthrop is also referencing this understanding that the Puritan leaders also had of establishing a new Jerusalem in this new world that they're arriving at. So their mission was to establish God's heavenly city on earth, right? In God's country and God's city in particular as the New Jerusalem. And this kind of thinking and ideation would be consistent throughout US history and understanding of American exceptionalism. And the specific language that Winthrop uses is picked up again, the US as a shining city on the hill, famously by John F. Kennedy in 1961 as president-elect in a speech to the nation, again emphasizing the US as exceptional, as heavenly, and as a heaven on earth, or striving to be so. But the person, the political leader who uses this phrase, shining city on the hill, as the most, over 20 times in political speeches, and the most famously, I would have to say, is Ronald Reagan. So I am going to read you, here is Ronald Reagan as an apocalyptic seer. I'm going to read to you a text of Reagan's farewell speech, which he gave in 1989 as he's leaving his two-term presidency. And this is his most famous use of the phrase shining city on a hill. And I will compare it then to the text found in Revelation chapter 21. So listen carefully to it. In it, Reagan really positions himself as the seer, as the prophetic witness of the book of Revelation, describing what he sees. So let me read that text to you. I've spoken of the shining city all my political life, but I don't know if I ever quite communicated what I saw when I said it. But in my mind, it was a tall, proud city built on rocks stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds living in harmony and peace, a city with free ports that hummed with commerce and creativity. If there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get here. And that's how I saw it and see it still. Again, Reagan sounds like this ancient apocalyptic seer. He has a vision, right? I've spoken, I see it. This is how I see it. Sees the shining city. He sees it on this strong foundation, and he understands the city on the hill, the US, as this apocalyptic utopia. And he's plucking imagery directly from Revelation chapter 21, which describes the New Jerusalem on a firm foundation, filled with people, and a diverse group of people. Here, Reagan references teeming with all kinds, right? And bringing tribute and wealth, and with walls, but with doors, Reagan says, that are open. So compare this, let me read to you then, the ancient text of Revelation so you can hear the echoes in Reagan's speech. Revelation 21, in the description of the New Jerusalem says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. It has the glory of God and a radiance like a very rare jewel, like jasper, clear as crystal. It has a great high wall with 12 gates, and the wall of the city has 12 foundations, and on them are the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of earth will bring their glory into it. Its gates will never be shut by day, and there will be no night there. People will bring into it the glory and the honor of the nations. So you hear the ways that Reagan has borrowed from this description. So what's the most interesting to me about Reagan's speech is that he is using this heavenly city imagery to talk about immigration. He sounds very pro-immigration. He's describing the city with open doors, the symbol of hospitality. And he wants people from everywhere, right? The nations, as it's described in Revelation, to come to enrich and to be creative in the United States. And he's using Revelation to cast a vision for US immigration. So listen to the next part of Reagan's speech, the very next section of his farewell speech. He says, after 200 years, 2 centuries, she still stands strong and true on the granite ridge, and her glow has held steady no matter what storm. And she's still a beacon, still a magnet for all who must have freedom, for all the pilgrims from all the lost places who are hurtling through the darkness toward home. So Reagan is really reusing Puritan understanding and ideation. He's referencing that here through the use of pilgrims, right? Claiming US as a beacon and a haven for the saints. These are the pilgrims from all the lost places, alluding to the Puritans. And there's an implied Christian saintliness of these imagined travelers, and the designation, identification of other countries as lost places. They're also hurtling through the darkness in this apocalyptic, otherworldly dimension. And Reagan implies that the US can be a home for these particular travelers. So the question then I ask is, who are welcomed as the travelers and who are not? To whom can the US be an apocalyptic home? So I ask these questions because the image of America as a city, as the New Jerusalem, is ultimately problematic and exclusionary. The vision takes this vast land, a land that was already actually inhabited by thousands of indigenous people, and erases them in their past, and then casts this vision of a 3 million square mile country, shrinking it into a city, right? A city with an encircling wall, as cities historically have been, cities of being places of refuge with a wall to protect those who are inside, and protecting them from what? Protecting them from threat from the outside. And these threats are then understood as trying to infiltrate and trying to invade. So then who are these threats? So once The English and European colonialists had settled in America. They then identified themselves as natives, right? Became nativists in understanding themselves as those who belong and constructing a white European identity as the quintessential American citizen. So then those who are not, who do not belong to this white identity, could be those who are identified as those who must be kept outside, right? The threat, who are outside and at the city walls, who must be excluded. And Revelation details also in its symbolism and in its description of events what kind of threats these are. So who are outside and who must be excluded from the New Jerusalem. I'm just going to read several quotes from Revelation that detail what these might be that are outside. So here we have, for example, from Revelation chapter 9, that smoke came from locusts on the earth. They were given authority like the authority of scorpions. On their heads were what looked like crowns of gold. Their faces were like human faces, their hair like women's hair, and their teeth like lions' teeth. This is a plague that comes upon the earth, threatening. This is before the heavenly Jerusalem descends. From chapter 16, we have the pouring out of the bowls of God's wrath. And here, the fifth bowl being poured out upon those who had worshipped the beast it's being poured out, and its kingdom, the beast's kingdom, is plunged into darkness. The peoples gnawed their tongues in agony and cursed the God of heaven because of their pains and sores, and they did not repent of their deeds. So there is also the existence of plague and those being inflicted upon those who had worshipped the beast. Here, this is after the descent of the New Jerusalem, and it's stated, nothing unclean will enter it, nor anyone who practices abomination or falsehood, but only those who are written in the Lamb's book of life. And I'll just draw your attention to the understanding not just of morality or righteousness as qualifications for entering, but also the association of being unclean or filthy or dirty as those that must be kept out. And this is also those who practice abomination or falsehood and who are not in the record, who are not written down in the Lamb's book of life. So remember that. There's also the identification of those outside with evil doing. And again, with filthy, there's often this equation of filthiness, dirtiness with moral corruption and evil doing. And then finally, sorry, I'm just going to move this, are the dogs, the sorcerers and the fornicators and murderers and idolaters and everyone who practices falsehood. So we have a whole amalgamation of characters and elements identifying those who are outside, and the labeling of them as dogs, right, as bestial or dirty, who don't belong, along with practicing magic, sorcery, fornication. So we have the identification of sexual deviance and idolaters, so practicing a different worship or ritual, and everyone who practices falsehood. So all of these different elements making up for those who must be kept outside. It's an array of identifiers, right? And also an array of rhetoric to label those who should be kept outside. And this is exactly the rhetoric that has been applied to Chinese immigrants to keep them out and to label them as unfit to enter the United States or to be citizens since Chinese immigration to America has begun. These very particular labels are those being used. So what follows is a series of images, historical images that I'm going to show you to discuss some of these labels and rhetoric being used against Chinese immigrants and Chinese immigration. Some of them are very offensive, so I'm just going to put that up front. But it shows these particular labels being used in popular media, in advertisement, in newspapers. But I'll begin with this one. So this is something that came out in 1898 in Harper's Weekly. It was created before and circulated in Europe, but this is at the height and peak of panic over what is called yellow peril. So a growing understanding of threat that China poses and the Chinese people. And here we have apocalyptic imagery of this Archangel Michael, who's a figure in apocalyptic works, who has his flaming sword, and he's showing what seems to be a host of warriors, which are having the iconography of European nations, and showing them the threat. He's gesturing towards the threat, which we see in the distance as a flaming Buddha. And underneath the flaming Buddha, we have fire being set to what we can assume are European villages and towns, right? So this is the yellow peril overtaking, and is an image of both what would be identified as an idol, so identifying those as idolaters practicing a different faith, but also as a violent threat to both Europe and also to white Americans as they would see it. So this kind of apocalyptic imagery that's casting a vision of what's outside and what needs to be kept outside. Here's a newspaper clipping from 1892, and this is on the 10-year renewal of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And so this is to foment fear that that act will not be renewed. And it is identifying what is called in the headline a celestial horde, hovering above in Canada, waiting to invade the United States. And so there's a play on words here. So celestial is referring to a traditional older reference of China as Tianchao, right, as the heavenly kingdom. But celestials are then become a mocking, ironic slur to use against Chinese peoples. And so playing with this, we have a celestial horde, and a horde, of course, is often used in identifying Chinese peoples, right? It's, or Asian peoples. I'm thinking of a word that's being used for a large group of anybody we don't like, right? So celestial horde, almost like a unholy angelic crowd waiting literally to descend from Canada on doomsday, right? The midnight, the minute the clock strikes 12 on the night of the 3rd, when this act needs to be renewed. So this is a positioning of that particular threat coming into the United States. Now, moving on to thinking about filth and the identification of Chinese people with filthiness, we have this particular poison advertisement that does two things, right? Obviously, it advertised the poison that's rough on rats, and it says they must go, referring to the pests, but of course also identifying the Chinaman, the coolie in the middle of the advertisement is also one that must go. And the Chinaman is depicted as eating a rat, doing something that's disgusting and abominable, and identifying this identity as something that is completely unassimilable to American identity and American society. So there's an equation of not belonging, right, to filth and dirtiness, and labeling Chinese immigrants in this particular and disgusting way. That's continuing. And related to that, of course, is also disease. So this is from 1882, San Francisco's news magazine, The Wasp. And here we have the ghosts or figures haunting over San Francisco of malaria, smallpox, and leprosy. And here you can see leprosy actually is a stereotypical China man with the Q over coming from his head. And also he is pouring out, reminiscent of the bull of God's wrath, right, leprosy or disease onto Chinatown. In the center of this, almost in the middle, is this church standing bravely in the middle, right, withstanding the horrors of these particular diseases. And so there is, again, the identification of filth and disease with Chinese identity seen as particularly prone to disease. And then here, of course, is something much more recent from 2020. From just last year, during the pandemic, we have the identification of COVID as a particularly ethnic and racial identified virus, and the identification of Chinese peoples as absolutely disgusting. So this is reminiscent of the rough on rats advertisement, right, in which the Chinese will eat anything, and so therefore they are completely foreign and unassimilable and deserving and prone to the disease that they suffer from. And so again, this rhetoric is continued and renewed in anti-Chinese rhetoric and also anti-Chinese immigration understanding of who belongs, who doesn't belong, who can ever assimilate and who cannot. And this is a combination of filth, disease, moral corruption, etc. So here, this is another step beyond the identification of Chinese as prone to disease or suffering from plague, but the depiction of the Chinese as a plague themselves, right? So as taking over the land. And this you will remember from Revelation chapter 9, when I read to you almost exactly that particular description of the Chinese as locusts who are consuming everything, and they have faces like human faces, hair like women's hair, and they're coming in to destroy Uncle Sam's farm, right? They're going to consume everything. And there's this demonic figure in the background driving them towards the United States. This is a figure of famine who shows up in Revelation chapter 6. And so here we have a whole bunch of apocalyptic depictions or symbols depicting the Chinese and immigration as devouring everything and as part of an apocalyptic plague that's going to overtake and invade the New Jerusalem. There's also, you remember, the identification of outsiders as fornicators, those who are sexually immoral, sexually deviant. This is also part and parcel of depictions of Chinese immigrants, and particularly Chinese female identity in the United States. Here we have the film star Anna May Wong being depicted as a dragon lady. So there are several things going on in this picture in which she is sexualized in the clothes she's wearing. Remember, this is 1931, so this is not just, you know, your regular costume, but also highly orientalized in the kind of costume that she is wearing, and the shadow she casts is that of a dragon. So not just a sexual temptation or a sexual entertainment, right, or fetishization, but also a threat, right, that she hides something behind or beneath the surface, that ultimately she's going to represent yellow peril, right, the dragon being a symbol that had been used in the Manchu period, and also here symbolizing Chinese identity as something that in Revelation is definitely identified as the enemy of the New Jerusalem, as the opposing force that's about to invade. And this final image I want to focus on is a little less direct than those particular labels, but this is a picture of an interrogation of a young boy at the Angel Island Detention Center. And some of these interrogations would last for hours and hours and generate a ton of paperwork and files when Chinese immigrants were asked to answer questions and to give descriptions of their home village for hours on end. I'm here and I want to just underline the reliance on records and record keeping, right? So to me, and this might seem far-fetched at first, but it echoes the logic of apocalyptic entry into the New Jerusalem. So we read upon the descent that there's the judgment of the dead. And what it says is what I like to call the most bureaucratic verse of the New Testament, in which books are opened and they're consulted. And so there's all these records, and this is part of an apocalyptic trope in which records must play something in the entry of or exclusion from a heavenly city. And this is also the logic being played within US immigration. To us, it seems a matter of fact, right? Of course, but that's also because it's been a part of immigration understanding and logic. And oftentimes there is no logic to the way records are consulted. So there's absurd stories of interrogation at Angel Island when you have to prove who you are. Now, I'm not going to romanticize immigrants. There are many Chinese immigrants who were absolutely not who they said they were at Angel Island, but at the same time, they were subjected to medical examination, interrogation, questioning things like how many steps are in your home village house? Is the kitchen on the south side or on the west side? And so they would create these test booklets on their voyage to America because they knew they would be subjected to these absurd tests when they got to the detention center. So there's a logic of records that I find fascinating that's going on both in the apocalyptic text and then also reified and created in the process of US immigration, in which there's the judgment and the reference or the recourse to record keeping of identity and the past of one's life. So I'm going to conclude with this slide just to think again of the people and the families who are a part of this, who through this rhetoric and through this history and this kind of conceptualization of the US as a New Jerusalem and as this apocalyptic city has then also led to the exclusion and the labeling of others that must be kept out, those who are unwanted as idolaters and fornicators and dogs. To think of how that's reflected in the laws that were passed in the Page Act of 1875 and the Exclusion Act and subsequent immigration laws and current attitudes towards Chinese immigration and immigrant communities, in particularly in this current crisis. So I'll leave it at that. And I know we have some time for discussion. So I'll let Devin lead that.
Thank you so much. That was so fascinating. And it's shocking how a lot of those images are still circulating today, in same old tropes as well as new ways. And and I've studied my share of this stuff, and still I'm seeing new images come up. And so thank you so much for that, and for making that connection. Um, so I'm sure lots of people were also extremely fascinated by your talk. So we're going to move to a time of Q&A and discussion. And I know that people sometimes take a while to get warmed up with their questions, or they're typing it out or whatever. So I guess I'll throw out the first question, which is to say, um, again, I'm quite familiar with a lot of this imagery and these words, but to make that connection to the Book of Revelation and to see um, how like throughout history there has been this connection and this stream of using these images. How did you personally first kind of make that connection? Because none of this is new on either side, right? Like clearly the U.S. is rooted in these Christian ideas and these images, and then clearly there have been these images that have been used for racist purposes throughout history. But how did you make that connection between those two, either from your own like personal experience or academically?
Yeah, thank you for that. So this is going to reflect my very non-methodical way of doing research. It's really through free association. So, and also having to do with being raised in San Francisco Bay Area. So I think I was musing on the names that are being used to describe San Francisco and the area surrounding, and just California in general. So thinking of the Golden State, thinking of the Golden Gate, Angel Island, also of Chinese reference to San Francisco and to America in general as Jingsan as Gold Mountain, and San Francisco as Jiujingsan as Old Gold Mountain now. So that was just musings on why this, I mean, heavenly, maybe not an intention or origin description of these particular places, which led me to think about what were attitudes. And there is a connection, as I said in the beginning, of like a broader understanding of apocalypse and immigration of entering a new world and changing a new world. But then thinking about actually the United States has been conceptualized from its discovery as a step in the end of the world. I mean, Columbus was understanding it, his discovery to be a mission to end the world, to bring about recapturing of the old Jerusalem and to convert, those who he found in this new world. So there is this general fascinating conceptualization of the US as this eschatological destination. And so how I began to think about how that tied in with then, well, there's exclusion and that's part of the metaphor. So how does that work in who we see? And so just following that, finding this kind of imagery and this kind of rhetoric, I mean, which is obviously used in other ways as well, but it has so many shared images and symbols within the usage of Revelation that I started to follow that trail.
Great, thank you. All right, some questions. Let's start with Midi.
Thank you so much. This was really super interesting. Full disclosure, my scholarship is on medieval European religious history, so I don't actually know a lot about this. So I learned so much. But I teach a course. It's a first-year seminar on marriage, and I'm at a Jesuit Catholic university, and we did a lot of work around immigration when it was the papal year of grace around immigration. And in this, we talked about immigration to the United States and marriage in particular. And I have a colleague who's an immigration historian. And I asked him, like, well, is there immigration marriage law? And he put together a list for my class, which was very kind. And it is so heavily anti-Asian immigration. Really interesting. And we get really interesting conversations with the students around this. And it particularly targets Asian women and marriage and coming to the United States. And there is a very obvious shift in this sort of immigration marriage legislation happening after the Second World War, with the sort of alliances with China and sort of interactions with sort of the supporting Japan. This is where sort of the popular image of the enemy shifts from being Japan to being Nazi Germany in like movies and stuff. And I'm wondering if there's a shift in sort of the 40s and then into the 50s and 60s in apocalyptic imagery when it comes to Asian immigration that would correspond with this. I don't know if you know, I don't know if there is, but I'm just really curious. Thank you so much.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. I mean, there's so many things that I want to address. I mean, I want to point, I mean, from what you said, and I know you probably already know this from what you just said, but the Page Act in 1875 effectively banned Chinese women. I mean, that was the purpose of that law, is to keep them from entering the United States, and the first federally restrictive immigration law, which I'm like, wow, what a privilege. Like, that's me. Like, I'm not allowed in. That was the aim of that particular law, so that there could be no growing of community of Chinese immigrant communities, right? There was no marriage because there was no miscegenation allowed at the time. And so there couldn't be naturally born citizens within these communities or marriage. So coming off of that and the shift, it's so interesting the way language changes around political ties and what's accepted. So for example, the Philippines, you could enroll as an American soldier when it's US territory and gain citizenship, but that is revoked when the Philippines stop being a US territory. So just the give and snatching back of that particular privilege, depending on political power and military presence, right? So I think the problem with pinpointing apocalyptic imagery with Chinese identity in particular is that in the US, that rhetoric gets really lost because Asians become a giant group of people that have no distinctive characterization in the popular cultural knowledge, right? And also in rhetoric. And so no matter whether it's Japan or, and later Japan becomes the enemy in the 1980s as an industrial power, right? That also gets visited upon all Asians who are East Asians that are in the United States. So there's land of the rising sun and all of these things, right, being identified with Japan and this apocalyptic new power that's taking over. That's of course shifted back to China in the last 20 years or so as that's changed. So you'll see the focus on that, but in the end, those who suffer from that apocalyptic imagery, I would say, are all Asians in the United States, whether immigrants or not, whether coming from that particular country that's targeted or not, which is, so this is a much vaster phenomenon that's going on.
Great, thanks for that question. Next, we have Yii-Jan.
So thank you, Dr. Lin, for your fantastic presentation. For those of us such as me who aren't as familiar with the Christian scripture, could you help us explain a little more this idea of apocalypse? For example, does it guide what most Christians regard as the final destination of ideals? So I'm partly asking this question because a lot of the rhetorics you hear today from some of the most anti-immigrant politicians, they claim to be solid Christians when they pander to certain demographics in voting, but don't seem to actually embrace other Christian values, such as caring for people.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I would say apocalypse and the revelation of John in particular is highly problematic for Christian faith for several reasons. It is part of the Christian canon and part of the New Testament, and it's part of a larger tradition of Jewish apocalyptic literature that in part has, ironically, right, a very anti-empire, anti-earthly power theme to it. At the same time, it's also highly empirical and pro-empire of God, right? So whoever takes over that text can manipulate it to be supporting the power that they see as God's power, right? And so in America, in a broad, popular, maybe evangelical Christian understanding of that book, you can use it, and because it's so malleable, it's apocalyptic, is so full of imagery, and it's so slippery and protean in the way you can use it, it can be shaped so that it supports the power that you want, the idea and the identity that you want to put forward as God's, right? The God's people, God's country. So that's, I think that's one of the major ways that it's been shaped. I mean, and it's used to explain. So there are people who take it very literally and people who don't, right? And so, but there are those who would use it to predict, like clockwork, when the end of the world is coming, and these nations represent these particular identities within the book. And then there are people who see it more symbolically or representing different things, everything from hope and faith to exclusion and violence, right? So everything in between. That's the part of the problem with dealing with apocalyptic is it can be so changeable, and I don't think there's any one essential interpretation that's reachable. I don't know if that's ever reachable, but especially not for apocalyptic. And so revelation can become this thing, and it has. And the use of it to talk about disaster also often comes with the idea that there are those who deserve it, or there are those who are reaping these particular things. So it's been used to talk about AIDS epidemic, for example, or disease, immigration. It's been used to talk about natural disasters, things like that, to identify what's happening. And that carries with it identification, and depends on who's interpreting it to link which identity with what. So I think that's what I would see as the kind of the major role it's played in popular culture, in Christian popular culture. I mean, I'm speaking very broadly, but in the United States. I hope that answers the question.
Great. Let's see. Great question. Very good to clarify some of those ideas. Next, we have Edith with another question.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to slightly challenge something that I think you said a minute ago, which was that Asians as a group are differentiated within this apocalyptic kind of vision of white supremacy and discrimination. Because if you look back at anti-immigrant rhetoric and just straight racist rhetoric, Blacks are still kind of seen as smelly, bad, they had to, you had a whole separate system of public services in the South. Before that, Irish, you name it. So I wanted to just throw out the idea that for Asians in particular, because you're so far away, it's perceived as a very distant culture, and people have few reference points for it until perhaps the mission movements of the 1930s, when you saw quite large numbers of Americans and white Americans answering relief calls for flooding in the Yangtze and so forth. And then you had this great kind of image making in the novels of Pearl Buck, so that you suddenly have these very positive images of Chinese, which are carried over into some of the, into sort of World War II and the Allied kind of effort, the Allied effort against the Japanese in China, where you have some very heroic posters of Chinese, and then you get a kind of a moderation of that image. So I just wondered what you had to say about the trope of the good Asian. Maybe it's a bit like that of the good Black, just someone who knows their place. But how does that fit into your argument?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that, so this talk is focused primarily on anti-Chinese immigration, but in the book, I'm actually dealing with US immigration as a whole. So you're correct. It is, for example, there's a chapter on filth and plague and disease, and that is identified with different people groups throughout, not just Asian immigrants coming to the United States, but as you said, with Irish and cholera and tuberculosis, and particular Jewish and Italian communities, ameliorated a little bit by how assimilable they might seem to be, and to mix into wider American culture. So there's all sorts, disease is often, right, located within a certain ethnic community. So, and so there's wider stuff going on, and not just anti-Chinese, and also there's also different identity formations, of course, with African-American, Black identity in the United States, and then Indigenous, right? So all sorts of things going on. So I just want to acknowledge that. At the same time, right, in talking about the good Asian, I think it really is whatever is politically expedient, but it's never, I think, an admission that Chinese identity is American identity. It seems, you can be an ally, you can be a mission project, you can be somebody who's united against Japan and play upon those particular understandings and political standings, but I don't see an affirmation until, I still don't, right, of Chinese identity as fully American, or possible of being fully American and part of that particular identity. And I do think the model minority, the good Asian myth plays right into that, because it's politically expedient and it's part of the structure that upholds white supremacy, right? So it pits people of color and Asian identities against each other as well. Because there are Black and brown Asians that East Asians in particular, I think, are guilty of playing into and taking hold of that particular model minority myth and making that a part of their particular attitude and understanding of self.
Great, thank you. And I think that that's a great kind of conversation that we can like totally keep going on if once I get around there, there's more time. A question from Wang. The question is pretty simple, but also very, very large, which is, for years, has the US government done anything to change these unfriendly impressions that the public has of Chinese people?
No. I mean, I think there's definitely a play into this model minority. And I mean, I don't know who's in this crowd, or who, I mean, you might be aware of Andrew Yang as a potential presidential Democratic nominee for presidential race last year. And I think of him, no offense to some of you who might love him, but as kind of like leading the charge for this very problematic understanding of Chinese and Asian identity in the United States that's based on a model minority myth. And I think that's what's been embraced so far. In laws that are enacted, always tied, I think, to political stance and international relationships. So who are we at war at? Who are we not at war at the time? Particularly tied to that. And then there's this idea of, immigrants are great because they are innovative and they bring wealth and they, do all these things. It's never that they're just human beings, right? So I think Asian immigration in a particular tone always plays into that particular model minority understanding to justify it, rather than simply human rights and human compassion.
Right, and there's always has been and always and continues to be a very patronizing tone, right? So even in this idea, I mean, and not just with Asians, but in other immigrant groups as well, right? Like this idea of a good, a good version of this particular type of immigrant or whatever, right? And that continues to today. I did realize that good point, which is we don't know exactly who is in this crowd, and so maybe it is good to sort of define some of these terms that some of us are more familiar with. So could you also explain just real quickly model minority and what that means and how we're using that term?
Yeah, so very briefly, I would say model minority is a label that's applied to mostly East Asian identity in the United States and elsewhere. I would say that says this is the kind of minority or the person of color or community that you should be like. Whether it is, the usual tropes are, they really value education, they are really good at science and math, they achieve well in school and they go on to good jobs. They don't go to prison, right? Like Blacks. They don't, work the fields because they care about education, unlike Latino immigrants. So there's this pitting against, but using this model minority myth to identify. And it's also quite classist and skin color based. So it's used generally to East Asian identity, of which I am a part, and also class privilege and economic privilege. So it also has a very narrow view of what Asian identity might be in the United States. And, I am actually part of that view. So my parents came in a wave of immigrants that came after 1965 as graduate students with scholars to PhD programs. That's the kind of model minority that the US is, or general understanding of this model of what you would want to be like, and pitted that using as, if they can do this, they must have worked harder. They must have not have privilege or not have a particular stance in life. But if you can't be that, right, then you are not a good minority. You're not a good immigrant. You're not, you're representative of your race, right? So it's used in this very essentializing, stereotypical way against others. And the more particular people embrace that, I think, then that just reinstates and makes it even stronger, because then it's like, well, these Chinese people think that, so it must be true. So it's part of that entire problem.
Right. And of course, the concept itself is inherently problematic, right? Because who's to determine who the model is, right? Like
Right.
that already implies a very hierarchical, as you said, and racist idea. Elizabeth.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I was really excited to hear about your new work. I wanted to go back to the Book of Revelation and your reading of it in relationship to these more contemporary political dynamics. So two different questions. One has to do with the focus on visuality in the text and the replication of attention to visuality in the images that you use to illustrate your talk. And I just wanted to ask you to talk to us a little bit about the relationship of that particular activation of a particular sense of vision with the kind of emotional or affective activations that happen, both in the Book of Revelation with all of its excesses that get resolved through, excessive violence. And so you kind of reach a stasis after you've, made everybody really anxious, and then, you take care of it by, bringing down the walls and, and achieving a kind of pacific state of being. So that one question. And then the second has to do with how do you think about, given that race as a category is a historicized category, is produced, in a particular intellectual framework, and we're looking at an ancient text that was written sort of pre-race in a certain sense, but clearly we know that there's ethnic reasoning going on in antiquity too. But so how do you sort of think those two things together across that broad chronological spread?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, those are great questions. Thank you for that. I think I remember this when I read the Book of Revelation as a little girl. I would read it as I was bored in sermons, and I would read Revelation 21 because I love the depiction of the New Jerusalem. Is it's just, to me, it was so pretty, and it had all these gems. Like there's so much of that, and it was affective too. It was like this thinking of this sparkling, beautiful thing, and I think that is like. And there's in aesthetically it is described as pure, right? So there's like streets of pure gold, and it's crystal, and it's see-through, and there's kind of this cleanness of that vision that's created at the end, that's kind of cleaning up. And I mean, it's like everything else is balled up and thrown into the fire, right? So like all the mess, all the chaos that's described in these bizarre images beforehand. I mean, we have breaks, we have a throne room, etc. But like there's all this horrible mess on the rest of the earth after the plagues, after famine, after death, all of these things, and earthquakes and blood. And I think that's also effective, and then the need to get rid of that, and the heading towards purity, the heading towards a clean, pure place in that aesthetic sense is really powerful. And I think part of that gets reflected in the idea that we need to expel the dirt. We need to get rid of the chaos and the mess, and those things get aesthetically transferred onto the way we think about people, right? The way we think about, I mean, ethnic groups, communities, and aesthetics, right? So you have gleaming towers and skyscrapers and this understanding. And then you have like the mess of Chinatown, right? Which is just like laundry and chickens and, you know, all these sorts of things. And there's an identification of immigrant enclaves as that kind of aesthetic as versus the gleaming Fifth Avenue, whatever buildings. I think there's something at play in that kind of way of thinking that gets transferred. And then leading into like, how do we think about race and ethnic reasoning in something that I don't know. There is the hint of ethnic reasoning, I think, in the letters when we begin, right? So, or maybe not. The location of this in Asia Minor and this tour of the 7 churches in the beginning of Revelation and the identification of who are false Jews and who are true. There's the beginning of an ethnic identity that is pure or that is authentic, that is held up against that which is false. And then an identification of Rome and Babylon, I think, as those who are symbolic of those outside. So not necessarily a racial construction as we would have in the modern world, but a use of authenticity and then also a use of other powers to locate identity. So yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily there, but it lends itself really easily, especially like the mark of the beast or the mark of those who are in Jerusalem becomes something on your skin, right? Something that becomes embodied that then can be recognized and pointed out. And so that can be really easily adapted into racial construction and ethnic identity. Thank you. I mean, that's leading me into thinking about other stuff, so that's exciting.
And also, I am surmising that probably your first book probably has some answers to that question as well, right? Bonnie.
Thanks for the opportunity. My question is simple. I'm a mother of a young kid. We are not in US. We are in China. We have been thinking about sending our kids overseas for studies, but we don't know. I mean, how would the young generations in the US, I mean, the native US, the Chinese, Asian would actually cope with the situation right now? Thanks.
That's a tough question. And I mean, I have 2 kids of my own, and I live in a pretty white dominant town in Connecticut. I think, I mean, it really depends on I don't even want to say, it's very unpredictable. So there is an overtone of anti-Asian sentiment that you'll see in the news, and that is in the air. So that's discussed. And if your children came to the United States, they would, if you discuss that with them, or if they watch the news, if they talk, it depends on their age too, of course, but that's part of now the general conversation. And then of course, what I also wanted to mention, of course, was the shootings of the 6 Asian women in Atlanta last month. So there is violence being enacted, and also against elderly Asians. So that's in the general water of what's going on. Now, in terms of like personal confrontation and suffering, that's going to vary, and it's very unpredictable. So for example, I would have thought, right, naively, that, you know, in the Bay Area or in California where I grew up, it would, you know, we're light years ahead. You know, I grew up there. It was bad in the 1980s when I was growing up, but should be better now. But actually, some of those attacks are happening in particular areas in the Bay Area. Whereas in Connecticut, I haven't encountered that sort of thing at all, and my children neither, in their particular elementary school. So it really, I don't think that kind of personal encounter is predictable. It's more of the state of discussion and the news and what's happening. I think casual racism is everywhere, and microaggression is everywhere. So there is, it still does happen, and it does happen, unfortunately, within school. So, but I think it also depends on personal circumstance and what you think is best. And then there are many things that could be enjoyed in coming here as well. I don't want to say that that's not the case. So, yeah, I'll just say that much.
Right. Evan has a question, which is Could you elaborate further on the difference of self-identification among different Asian ethnic groups in the US? Like, is there any difference between East Asians and Southeastern Asians, or even within East Asians? And what's the reasoning behind those differentiations, if there are any?
Yeah, so that's a huge question. I will just say that the term Asian American came out of inspiration of African American, that term, and the civil rights movement. So the use of Asian American was by those who identified as Asian now, embracing that term in order to build coalition for political activism and a struggle for civil rights in order to be unified. Of course, it covers a giant term. And in terms of, it differs, I think, in terms of whether in Canada, if you're in the United States, and of course, if you're abroad, Asian becomes it's a complete construction anyway, but like you begin to see it shifts quite a lot. So it includes in America, broadly speaking, you would have Filipino, you would have Thai, Vietnamese, Indian, so subcontinent, Pakistan, like included within Asia, East Asia, so Japan, Korea, China. So it's a giant umbrella term. There are some shared experiences, I would say, but I think it also, there's such a diversity of socioeconomic contexts and also experience based on skin color as well, of how people are treated. So there's also a confusion oftentimes of people, for example, from Indonesia or Philippines being understood as Latino. So there's like a confusion of race, but just by perception alone. So that's a difference in experience, and also difference in experience of why they come and what kind of jobs and what kind of sectors of economy they're a part of. Many of them come on scholarship and come to higher education, but many of them also come as laborers. So it really varies so vastly, which, you know, hence the giant umbrella term in order to build coalition. But I think oftentimes that's missed, and people think that their identity may be the only experience that's out there, which is problematic.
Great, thank you. So I think we're about close to the end, but I think, Edith, you snuck in right in time, so we will get one more question in.
Hi, yeah, it's a great presentation and a great thesis, because it relates directly to American exceptionalism and kind of the multiple sort of flaws within that. But my question is kind of relating to some of the others that have come up. How would you advocate campaigning for change? So for decades, you've had, what is it, the Committee of 100, the prominent Asian, Chinese Americans who have kind of fought that battle from within. Anyway, there are many examples of the way Chinese Americans and Asian Americans have fought prejudice. But sort of do you have a take on that? What is the what's the current best course of action?
Mm-hmm.
And how can non-Asian ethnic Asians support it as good as model, you know, no, I don't know, model whites and model non-Asians?
I mean, I will just qualify by saying I don't have expertise as a social activist or organizer. I wish I did. I do have friends who are working hard in this field, but I would say one thing is absolutely to build alliance and coalition with other peoples of color and indigenous peoples, because that is part of a greater strength and movement that we should be a part of rather than work cross purposes. Because there's all sorts of dialogue going on. But I think the more that Asian Americans and Stop AAPI Hate and Black Lives Matter and other like Chicanx movements, et cetera, can be a part of coalition, the stronger we can be, and the more nimble and sophisticated our understanding of racial identity and fighting for rights can be. So it needs to be something that is reaching out beyond our own personal identity communities. And that's one of the major things. Yeah, I mean, I don't have any great like great answers. I'm not sure anyone does, but I think that would be one of the first things that comes to mind. And for those who are allies, to make room to privilege those perspectives in conversation and those experiences as valid rather than to question. I think that's one of the biggest things, is to say, well, is that really right? And one of the major things, especially with the problem of model minority identity and experience, is to be like, well, but is that really so bad, right? Or is that really racist? And I think to change that conversation to say, let's validate BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color perspective and experience to understand what needs to be done, is one of the first things, to privilege that as part of the center of discussion. I mean, I don't have any other hard-hitting action items, but those are, I think, a positional thing that needs to happen in terms of dynamics.
Right. I think you touched on this earlier, which is there's a lot of positive imagery in Revelation as well, and a lot of beautiful imagery, right? And one of the most beautiful is when it talks about, at the end, there's a wedding feast, right? And everybody comes together at the wedding table, at the banqueting table, and people of all tongues and tribes and nations come together. And I think at its best, like, that's what that American ideal is supposed to be. And so I guess I would say, I would just add a small point, is like, be hopeful. I think I think it's really easy to talk about these things and be really bogged down by it and be really upset about it, because it is really upsetting. But I would add, maybe be hopeful, and I think that those social activists that have been doing it, like, you have to have hope in order to be doing these things. And so I just thought we'd end on a positive note there.
That's right.
But thank you so much. A fantastic conversation. A very, very invigorating, and now I'm awake for the rest of the day now. I'm excited to read your book when it comes out. So at Yale Center Beijing, for these Zoom events, we do have a tradition, which is we ask everybody to turn on their webcams if possible, so that we can take a group picture. And thank you, everybody, for coming. Have a good evening for those of you guys in China, and a good rest of the day for those of you guys in the US.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming.
Fascinating.
Thank you.
Good to see you all.
Good night from Hong Kong.